Look at this photograph from 1875. Is this man Amish? The beard says yes, the simple clothes say yes, the hand-built tools say yes, but he's actually a Presbyterian tobacco farmer from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. His neighbor 3 farms down, also bearded, also in dark wool, also riding a horse-drawn wagon. That neighbor was Amish, and for most of American history, you couldn't tell the difference just by looking. For nearly 2 centuries, the Amish didn't look distinct because everyone looked like them. We all wore wool and cotton, plowed with horses, lit our homes with oil lamps, and considered a trip to the next county an adventure. The separation between Amish and American wasn't a visual divide. It was a religious preference you'd only notice if you attended their church service, which was in German, held every other Sunday, and lasted about 3 hours. But somewhere between your great-great-grandfather's childhood and your grandfather's adulthood, that invisible line became a canyon. In roughly 1 generation, the Amish transformed from your average rural neighbor into a living museum exhibit. The question everyone asks is, when did they decide to stop modernizing? The better question is, when did modernizing become mandatory? Today we're tracking down the exact decade when the split became visible, the specific inventions that forced the choice, and the war that made their way of life actively dangerous. The Amish arrived in Pennsylvania starting in the 1720s, part of William Penn's holy experiment in religious tolerance. They came from Switzerland and the German Palatinate, fleeing persecution for their Anabaptist beliefs. Their defining characteristics: adult baptism, pacifism, and a commitment to agricultural community living. But here's what they weren't: technologically frozen. They adopted the Pennsylvania long rifle when it became available in the 1750s. They switched from sickles to scythes when better harvesting tools arrived. They used the same plows, the same wagons, and wore the same basic clothing as every other German immigrant farmer in the colonies. In 1790, a visitor to Lancaster County wouldn't have identified Amish families by their appearance. You'd have noticed they spoke German at home, refused to swear oaths, and didn't participate in militia musters during the Revolution. But visually, they blended in completely with Mennonites, German Reformed farmers, and even English Quakers. Dark colors were practical for farm work. Beards were normal for married men across most of rural America. Women wore bonnets because everyone wore bonnets. Buttons versus hooks and eyes? Nobody cared because you'd never see someone's fasteners under their work coat anyway. This invisibility lasted remarkably long. In 1850, an Amish farmer and a Methodist farmer in Ohio would have been wearing nearly identical clothing, both in dark wool coats, both in wide-brimmed hats, both with full beards, if married. The Industrial Revolution was churning in northeastern cities, but rural America changed slowly. Agricultural life still dictated the rhythm. You woke with the sun, you worked until dark, you went to bed because kerosene was expensive. The first crack appeared not with a car engine or electric light, but with a copper wire. The telephone arrived in rural Pennsylvania in the 1890s. The first lines connected towns, then started creeping down country roads. For the Amish, this posed a philosophical problem that sounds almost quaint now. A telephone line literally connected your home to the outside world. It brought the voices of strangers into your kitchen. It meant you could be interrupted at any moment by someone miles away, someone you might not even know. Amish bishops started debating the telephone around 1905. The arguments got heated according to letters preserved in the Mennonite Historical Library. Some argued that the telephone was just a tool like a better plow. You could use it to call a doctor in an emergency, to arrange crop sales, to coordinate barn raisings. Others saw it as a dangerous thread pulling their community toward dependence on the wider world. The debate split congregations. In some districts, bishops allowed phones in small shanties at the end of driveways, not in homes, a compromise that satisfied almost nobody. But the biggest threat to their lifestyle wasn't the telephone. It was something that didn't fit in a shanty, something that required roads and fuel and constant mechanical intervention. The automobile arrived in American driveways between 1908 and 1920. Henry Ford's Model T dropped from $850 in 1908 to $260 by 1925, putting car ownership within reach of middle-class farmers. Roads that had been mud, tracks for horses suddenly got graded, graveled, and eventually paved. By 1920, there were 9 million registered automobiles in America. By 1930, there were 23 million. This is when the visual split started becoming obvious. Your average non-Amish farmer could now drive 12 miles to a better market, 20 miles to a specialized doctor, 50 miles to visit relatives for Sunday dinner. The car didn't just change distance, it changed time itself. What took half a day by horse now took 30 minutes. That time savings meant farmers could work larger operations, hire themselves out for specialized services, send their kids to schools beyond walking distance. The economic pressure built steadily. Farmers with cars could simply do more, earn more, access more. The Amish watched their neighbors buy Fords and made a choice. Actually, it wasn't one choice. It was hundreds of individual congregation decisions between 1915 and 1935, each bishop interpreting the Ordnung, the unwritten rules of community life. Most concluded that the automobile represented a fundamental threat, not because of the machine itself, but because of what it enabled. A man with a car wasn't tied to his local community anymore. He could drive to a factory job in town and keep the farm just as a side operation. His children could attend consolidated high schools and get ideas about college, about professional careers, about lives that didn't involve manure and milking. The tractor arrived right alongside the car and caused even deeper splits. The Fordson tractor, introduced in 1917, could plow in a day what took a horse team a week. By 1925, you could buy a used tractor for $300. The economic argument was overwhelming. But here's what the Amish bishops saw. A tractor didn't need rest, didn't need to graze, didn't need the same relationship a farmer had with livestock. Horses required land for hay, time for care, patience for temperament. Horses kept you connected to natural rhythms. Tractors ran on gasoline purchased from Standard Oil. Tractors needed mechanics trained in combustion engines. Tractors pulled you into the industrial supply chain whether you wanted to be there or not. Most Amish congregations banned tractors for field work between 1920 and 1930. Some allowed them for belt power, running stationary equipment like threshers. The rules varied by district, creating a patchwork that outsiders found baffling. But to the Amish, each rule served a purpose: maintaining dependence on community, controlling the pace of life, keeping the family unit central to labor. So did the neighbors notice this divergence? Actually, they were too busy laughing. Letters to rural newspapers from the 1920s show a mixture of bemusement and condescension toward the plain people. One 1924 editorial in a Pennsylvania weekly newspaper described the Amish as quaint relics of a simpler time, whose children will surely abandon the old ways once they taste modern convenience. The assumption was that Amish young people would inevitably leave. Nobody thought the community would still be around in 50 years, let alone growing. The Great Depression actually strengthened the Amish position temporarily. When the stock market crashed in 1929 and banks failed across the country, Amish communities barely felt it. They didn't have stock portfolios. They rarely used banks beyond basic crop sales. Their economy ran on barter, mutual aid, and stored grain. While farmers with tractors struggled to make loan payments on machinery they couldn't afford to fuel, Amish farmers kept plowing with horses they fed from their own fields. For about 10 years, the backward approach looked remarkably resilient. But then came the war that turned their visible difference from curious to dangerous. World War II began for America in December 1941. Within months, the government instituted a draft requiring military service from men aged 18 to 45. The Amish had always been pacifists. They'd negotiated exemptions from military service going back to the Revolution, usually by paying commutation fees or accepting alternative service requirements. But World War II was different in scale and in fervor. The Selective Service Act did provide for conscientious objector status, and most Amish men applied for it. They were assigned to civilian public service camps, working in forestry, soil conservation, and mental hospitals instead of military service. This was legal, this was permitted, but it didn't sit well with neighbors whose sons were dying on Pacific Islands and European battlefields. A young Amish man in civilian clothes working in a forest camp in Oregon while his high school classmates stormed Normandy became a visible symbol of non-participation. The government also pushed war bond sales aggressively. Communities had quotas. Towns competed to show patriotism through bond purchases. Many Amish were reluctant to buy war bonds, viewing them as directly funding the war effort, which conflicted with their pacifist principles. The refusal to participate in bond drives, combined with their conscientious objector status, created tension with neighbors who saw bond purchases as essential patriotic duty. Some Amish reportedly faced pressure to purchase bonds, and their resistance was viewed by some as failing to support American troops. The social consequences were real. Amish communities faced discrimination and hostility during the war years. In several documented cases, Amish men in distinctive clothing were confronted in town and called cowards. The beard, the hat, the horse and buggy that had been merely old-fashioned in 1935 became markers of questionable loyalty by 1943. While the violence and vandalism against pacifist communities was more extensively documented during World War I, the social ostracism and verbal harassment during World War II was widely experienced. This is crucial to understand. The Amish didn't suddenly become more visible. They looked almost identical to how they'd looked for decades. What changed was the context. In peacetime, their plain dress was quaint. In wartime, it was suspect. The visual distinction that had been developing since the 1920s with cars and tractors now carried moral weight. After the war ended in 1945, the gap didn't close. If anything, American life accelerated away from the Amish baseline at an even faster pace. The GI Bill sent millions of men to college. Suburbs exploded around every major city. Television arrived in American living rooms, starting in 1948. By 1955, half of American households had a TV set. Superhighways connected cities. Commercial air travel became accessible to the middle class. The average American's daily experience in 1960 would have been completely alien to someone from 1900. The Amish baseline, meanwhile, looked remarkably similar to 1900. Still farming with horses, still lighting homes with kerosene or gas lamps, still traveling by buggy, still wearing dark plain clothing made at home. The frozen quality wasn't because they'd stopped thinking about technology. It was because they'd drawn a line based on careful, theological reasoning about community preservation, and they maintained that line while the world sprinted forward. Here's where the story gets more nuanced than most people realize. The Amish didn't reject all technology. They rejected technologies that threatened community cohesion or increased dependence on the outside world. This created some outcomes that look paradoxical to outsiders. Many Amish farmers today use diesel generators to power refrigeration equipment for dairy operations. That's acceptable because it's self-contained, it doesn't connect them to the power grid, and it serves a farm function that keeps them economically viable. They've adopted pneumatic tools powered by compressed air instead of electricity. Same functionality, different energy source, maintained independence. Some Amish districts allow solar panels now, not because they've decided renewable energy is theologically correct, but because solar power is self-generated and doesn't create dependence on utility companies. It's the same logic that led them to reject the telephone line in 1905. The question was never, is this technology evil? The question was always, does this technology pull us away from our community and toward reliance on outsiders? The buggy remains mandatory in most orders because the buggy maintains the geographic limitation that keeps community intact. You can only travel about 15 miles comfortably in a buggy before you're exhausted. That means your social circle, your economic activity, and your marriage prospects stay local. A car would let you range 50, 100 miles easily. Your daughter could court someone 3 counties away. Your son could take a factory job in the city and commute. The community would dissolve into individual families pursuing individual opportunities. The clothing maintained its distinctive quality, not through active preservation, but through passive continuity. The Amish kept wearing what they'd always worn: dark colors, simple cuts, nothing decorative. What changed was everyone else. Fashion cycles accelerated dramatically after World War II. Hemlines rose and fell, colors got brighter. Synthetic fabrics enabled new styles. By 1970, the average American teenager's clothing would have shocked their 1930s grandparents. The Amish just kept sewing the same patterns from the same materials, and the contrast became stark. The beard tradition actually has specific theological roots that most people miss. Amish men grow beards after marriage but shave their upper lip. The mustache was associated with European military officers in the 18th century. Refusing the mustache was a pacifist statement. Growing the beard was biblical, based on Leviticus passages about not marring the corners of your face. But in 1850, lots of American men wore beards. By 1950, clean-shaven was standard, making the Amish beard highly distinctive. Today, there are approximately 411,000 Amish in North America, up from about 5,000 in 1900. The community isn't shrinking or dying out. The retention rate hovers around 85%. Young people go through Rumspringa, a period of loosened restrictions in their late teens, experience the outside world, and overwhelmingly choose to return and be baptized. The economics still work for them, primarily through farming, construction, and manufacturing high-quality wood furniture that commands premium prices precisely because it's made by people who aren't rushing through production to check their phones. The exact moment when they became visually distinct depends on where you lived. In Pennsylvania, the split was obvious by 1925. In newer settlements in Indiana and Ohio, it took until 1935. In some isolated rural areas, the Amish didn't look dramatically different from their poorest non-Amish neighbors until after World War II brought prosperity and modern goods to even remote areas. But we can pinpoint the cultural moment when Amish became a distinct visual category in the American mind, the decade between 1940 and 1950. This is when the wartime context made their pacifism visible and controversial. This is when the post-war economic boom made car ownership universal for everyone except them. This is when consolidated schools and suburban development made their one-room schoolhouses and farm-based living seem genuinely archaic rather than just rural. The question we started with was, when did the Amish stop looking like us? But the more accurate question is, when did we stop looking like them? They maintained continuity with 19th century agricultural America. We underwent the most rapid technological and social transformation in human history. They didn't step backward. We just ran forward so fast that the gap between us became a spectacle. In 1875, that bearded farmer in dark wool wasn't making a statement. He was just farming. In 2025, his great-great-grandson wearing the same clothes, working the same kind of land with the same tools, is making a profound statement about what matters, about whether faster is always better, about whether connection to place and community might be worth the cost of missing out on convenience. The Amish didn't freeze in time accidentally. They chose a specific moment in technological development, evaluated what came after, and decided the trade-offs weren't worth it. That takes a kind of collective discipline that's almost impossible to find in modern America, where we adopt new technology first and ask questions later. we see them as relics. They might see us as people who traded depth for speed, who gave up knowing our neighbors for the ability to text strangers, who chose convenience over community so gradually we didn't notice what we'd lost. The split happened in your grandparents' lifetime. The bearded man in the buggy didn't come from the distant past. He came from the same starting point we all did. He just had the conviction to say, this far and no further, while we kept saying, what's next? So here's what I want to know. If you could go back to 1920 and choose one technology to reject, one invention that you think did more harm than good, what would it be? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want to see a follow-up about the specific technologies the Amish actually do use today, the diesel engines and solar panels that most people don't realize exist in their communities, subscribe and let me know. The story of what they kept is just as interesting as the story of what they rejected.